but we only do that in special circumstances anyways. Otherwise, the normal respiratory rate is 10 to 14.
Oh.
And you'll have a normal IU ratio. Okay, so the other thing that we can do is, the other thing that affects this, which is the last part of this, is something called flow. And when you talk about flow, or think about flow, I want you to think about flow. What flow is the speed of the breath. You can't deliver volume without flow, because you need that flow to get it in. So I relate flow to like the speed of your car, because you guys can all relate to that. How fast do you drive? So the faster you drive somewhere, the quicker you get there. So the faster or the higher the flow on the ventilator, the faster the breath will get in. So let's say in this example, the flow is 30. And in this example, the flow is 60 liters per minute. So normal flow is 40 to 80 liters per minute. You can go higher. You will sometimes be lower.
So we cannot go higher?
No, you can.
You can go higher. 40 to 80.
40 to 80 is the normal range. 60 is a good happy place for most patients. Like an I time of 1, a flow of 60. So here, our flow is 30, and let's say our I time is 1.2 seconds. Here, my flow is 60, which drops my I time to 0.8 seconds. So if you increase your flow, it's going to decrease your inspiratory time. So that's the third thing we can put over here. Increase flow. Because the faster the breath goes in, the less time you need to deliver it. Like the faster you drive, the less time it will take to get somewhere. Does that make sense? This is a very important concept to understand. Kelsey?
You said if you increase the flow, you decrease the what time?
The I time. And again, it happens automatically. If you change the flow, you change the I time. If you change the I time, you change the flow. What?
Are there some ventilators where you can only change flow or only change
Yes.
the time? Okay.
Yes. That's why we have different options here. Sometimes you can only change the flow, but by changing the flow, you change the I time. Sometimes you can only change the I time, but by doing that, you change the flow. So you're gonna fix or set what you can depending on the ventilator that you're on. But that's how you can manipulate the inspiratory time. If you go down on your flow, you're gonna make your I time longer. So there is one thing to consider now. If your I time is, if your flow is too low to deliver the volume that you want within a certain I time, you're gonna have a problem. So let's relate it to driving your car. You have 2 hours to get to San Francisco, but you can only drive 35 miles an hour.
Not gonna happen.
Can you get there in 2 hours? No. So imagine a scenario where your volume is 500, your flow is 20, and you made your I time 1 second. Your flow is too low to deliver the volume that you want within the time that you gave it. Just like driving somewhere at a slow speed. And so the ventilator won't let you do it. And you don't get like a loud alarm, but it won't let you change the volume. So say because it's a very common thing that students forget to do in the beginning, is check these parameters. They're like, because these parameters are not ordered by your doctor. These are things that you guys set at your discretion. So students, when they're just learning vents, you guys are gonna forget these parameters because you're gonna have your thing that says, put it on these, and you're gonna put it on those, and then you're gonna stop. But you have to remember, which is why I spend a lot of time on this, that these are settings that are at your discretion and have to be set, because if you set them improperly, your patient is going to be miserable. If you make your eye time 2 seconds, imagine how unhappy that patient would be. I've been breathing in forever. It's not going to work.
He'll be sedated, he won't know.
No, he won't be. And if you're Flo, I'm never going to get to San Francisco. So these are things you have to pay attention to. So eye time, the ratios, the flows, those are done at your discretion. And so you need to pay attention, and you're going to make sure you look at your ratios, you look at your eye times, and make sure they make sense. If you have to choose one over the other, say you set your eye time. Are you trying to take a picture? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Say you set your eye time to 1, and you're trying to change your flow. And to keep your flow, to keep your eye time where you want it, your flow has to be at 30. Eye time always takes precedence. So if your flow is a little bit lower than normal, but your eye time is good, you keep it there. Eye time takes precedence over flow. So eye time, more important than flow. Because that will happen. And you'll be like, Ms. Foss, my eye time's 1, but my flow, because maybe you have a low tidal volume because your patient's short. And so your flow's low. That's fine as long as your eye time is good and your ratio is good. Okay? Just like we'll learn about some other things that sometimes you have to pick one over the other. Okay, so everybody make sense now? Do you have a question, Julie?
You said if flow is too low, then the eye time is what?
No, I said if you have to choose, like say you have your eye time where you want it and it makes your flow less than 40, it's okay. As long as your eye time is where you want it and your ratio is good. So those will take precedence over flow, because sometimes you have to choose.
But previous to that, you said a phrase, if flow is too low, then.
If you increase the flow, you will decrease the eye time.
No, I said if the flow is too low, you have to be careful because it could take too long to get the breath in to deliver the volume that you want over a certain amount of time.
Okay, thank you.
And it'll, and like I said, it won't let you set it. It'll give you a little, kind of like like the ventilator be like, because you're trying to do something that you can't do. So it doesn't actually alarm, and you'll be like, Ms. Fawcett, the flow won't go over 400. I'm trying to do more, and it's because the volume won't go over 400 is because your flow's too low. And so once you fix your flow, then you'll be able to fix your volume that you want. So increased flow. Number 4, as Mitch mentioned, is to go down on the respiratory rate. Decrease respiratory rate. Because if you drop your rate, you're going to make your TCT longer, which is going to make your IE ratio longer. These 3 are the priority because they do not affect your minute ventilation. Which is abbreviated VE, so get used to that one. Or MVE, sometimes you'll see it as. This affects your minute ventilation. Remember, super important in this class, you have to know what makes up minute ventilation, tidal volume and rate. So if you mess with the tidal volume or the rate, you mess with your patient's minute ventilation. If you mean to, that's fine, but if my patient has good ABGs, then I don't want to mess with their minute ventilation if I don't have to, so I'm going to try to do it a different way. So that's your last resort. Any questions? No? Okay. So, patient triggered. So my patient triggered breath here now can be pressure. This marker's not going to work. Pressure or flow triggered. This is also known as the sensitivity. did we talk about sensitivity last term with what piece of equipment? The IPPB. Same concept. If it's if it's too sensitive, well, it's really important on a ventilator. If it's too sensitive, the ventilator is going to give a breath nonstop. And it's what we call auto cycle. It means it's just going nonstop. If it's not sensitive enough, the patient will never get a breath. So this setting is also very important and not dictated by a physician. So setting the sensitivity or the trigger, the patient trigger or the flow trigger properly is also very important. So this is only going to be affecting patient breaths that they're initiating. It doesn't affect time. Time is going to be given when it's time, no matter what, just like clockwork. But now if my patient wants a breath, how is the ventilator going to know? That's what we're telling you here. What will the ventilator sense so that it knows the patient's trying to take a breath, so it'll kick in and give one. So pressure sensitivity is not the best, but the concept is fairly easy to understand. It's just like, say you're at 0 here, -1, whoops, -1, -2, -3, +1, +2, +3. Pressure trigger or pressure sensitivity, number 1 is always positive. Sorry, always negative. I'm sorry guys, always negative. And the normal is -1 to -2. So if you see your sensitivity or your patient trigger and you see a negative number, then you know it's pressure. And by setting -1 or -2, we're telling the ventilator when you sense a drop in pressure of -1, if that's where it's set, or -2, if that's where it's set, that means the patient's trying to take a breath, so go ahead and give them one. If you put it all the way back here, you set it to -5, what's going to happen? Patient will never get a breath because they can't pull that back that far on a vent, or if they are, they're going to be doing this. You'll see this extreme chest movement and like almost going concave in because they're trying to pull so hard they can't get it. So your patient will look very uncomfortable. Yes?
Is that centimeters of water pressure? Or
Yes, it is centimeters. Pressure is centimeters of water. Yes. So -1 to -2. What if I set it at -0.5 or even -1 is kind of iffy sometimes.
Get a constant, right?
You're gonna get, because it's gonna think, so when you set it that sensitive, if you just bump the vent circuit, the ventilator thinks you're trying to take a breath. Because that's too sensitive. So then it's just gonna give that breath, the breath, the breath, the breath. Our lungs do this. Our test lungs in the lab. They make the vents auto cycle because they bounce all over the place and move around while you're using them. If you haven't noticed that, you will. You put your rate at 12 and it's going at a rate of 35. And you're like, why is it going at 35? This is not a human being attached. I set it at 12, it should be at 12. It's because the sensitivity makes it auto cycle, and that's what you see when something's auto cycling. So in the lab setting, you're gonna turn it to -10. But never on a real patient. And if you turn it to -10 in the lab, it'll stop doing that and give you the breath, actual breath that you want. But real people, -2 is actually a really perfect number. And when I describe flow trigger, which I will in a minute, I will tell you that pressure trigger is not favored. It's easier, it's harder for the patient to trigger the ventilator with pressure trigger than it is with flow trigger, which I'm going to show you why in a minute. So flow trigger is always positive number. And it's 1 to 10 liters per minute. And I'm going to use my vent circuit to show you how flow trigger works. Thank you. Everybody write that down real quick. 1 to 10. It's my little dot, like a bullet. Yes, liters per minute.
1 to 3 liters. Thank you.
Okay, so flow trigger works like this. Did you guys have a question on the homework that asked what bias flow was?
Yes.
Did anybody find it?
I Googled it.
What did it tell you?
Like oscillatory,
Yeah,
but.
Okay.
the flow oscillation. When you're in a certain mode.
Continuous flow of gas responsible for replenishing O2 and removing CO2 from the patient circuit.
Okay, right, so that everybody can hear that.
Bias flow is continuous flow of gas responsible for replenishing O2 and removing CO2 from the patient circuit.
So bias flow is nothing more than continuous flow going through your circuit. We call it bias flow, that it's a couple other things. Some ventilators have bias flow. Most of the new ones do now. Some of the ones that don't have bias flow is some of the older home care vents. But all the newer ICU ones do. Do you have a question?
Yeah, if that's continuous flow, then how does that differ from PEEP?
Because this is only in the circuit, that flow is, and PEEP is going to be down in your alveoli holding it open all the time.
So is that the dead space area?
And yes, just in here. Bias flow only exists in the circuit. It doesn't even enter the lungs until a patient tries to take a breath. And it's usually just on expiratory, you guys. So my patient has inhaled, and now I'm going to have bias flow running through my circuit. What's really important to understand is how it works. So, yes?
So with the bias flow, it's only on the expiratory circuit because it decreases the resistance?
No, it's only to help with trigger.
Okay.
So what's important to understand is how it works, you guys. So I don't want you to get too caught up in bias flow. It's not like I'm going to be testing you on the definition of it. So the way flow trigger works, so think if I'm hooked up to my vent, and this is my ET tube. If I'm using pressure triggered, my breath, so I'm going to take a little inhalation, that has to be sensed through the whole entire circuit, go back to the ventilator senses the drop in negative pressure, and it goes, oh, the patient wants a breath, and so then it gives a breath. It's got to travel all the way through the vent circuit and go to the patient. Yes, it is fairly quick. It looks instantaneous to you. You're not on the ventilator. But to a patient on the ventilator, it can seem like a long time because they've got a trigger. It's got to go all the way through the circuit, sense it at the ventilator, and now my breath comes back. So that's why pressure triggering is disfavored. It's very old school. Older people, older physicians are probably still stuck on it. But flow trigger is the best and the easiest to trigger and most comfortable for your patient. So flow is preferred over pressure. Let's say flow is favored, so the F's. Flow is favored. And the reason flow is favored is because if I'm using flow trigger, I've got flow right here, all the way through my expiratory side, all the way going back and forth basically. So if my patient tries to trigger a breath, what the ventilator is sensing instead of pressure at the ventilator is a drop in flow from the circuit. Because if I have 10 running through here, which is very common for flow to be for this situation, let's say I have 10 liters flowing through here, and I go to take a breath, what's going to happen? I'm going to get some of that flow right away. So I'm only having to trigger from here instead of from back at the vent. Plus, because the patient gets a small amount of air, it makes them more comfortable. And because you're only taking the drop from here, it's easier to trigger overall. So with flow trigger, instead of detecting a drop in pressure, you're detecting a drop in flow. And so once the ventilator senses that drop in flow, then it will give the patient a breath. And this is set different on the ventilators. So typically flow trigger, we leave it to default. Like the servo, it says as long as it's in the green. But between 1 and 10 is normal for flow trigger. So say you set it at 2, you just told the vent when the flow drops by 2 liters per minute, give the patient a breath, because that means the patient took some of it. As opposed to saying -2, it sends a drop in pressure of -2. So I compare it to, go ahead, Devin,
What was the normal that you said?
1 to 10
1 to 10.
for flow. So I compare this to a milkshake. You got a milkshake and you go put your straw in it, and the first time you take a sip, what happens? You gotta suck it through the straw, right? Super hard. That's like pressure triggering, because you gotta suck through the whole entire straw, every breath. But what happens the next time you go to take a sip? It's easier, right? Why is it easier? Because there's milkshake in the straw. Just like flow in the circuit. It's easier to trigger because of the same reason.
Compared to food. Got it.
Yep, food and cars. So does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So that's all for the first part. So if you guys have other questions, or you want a picture of the final over here, then get a picture, and then I'm going to erase it, and the last two will go quick. And then you'll have time to work on your ventilators today.
We did last time for you if you were
Oh yeah.
Flash was on.
so loud.
Yeah, no, we usually do. Somebody who did all that, throw those pictures in the chat too, so other people have them.
So, bias flows between two, and it senses the displacement flow, and it's just on and breathing.
Yeah. Okay.
This makes more sense. The book, I was like, huh?
Makes more sense when I talk about it, doesn't it? But I like that you guys have read it at least. That's,
I was like,
yeah, but it's important that you at least have an idea. So you've at least heard it, what I'm talking about. And then I explain it, make it all better.
like the pressure drink one made sense because I IPV,
Right.
but like the flow, I was like, okay. Makes it like I was like, I read it, I think I understand it, but.
Okay, so what is the next part, you guys? After the trigger comes what? What comes after the trigger? So the trigger starts at, what's the next part?
Limit.
Yes, the limit, thank you. So number 2 is the limit variable. So trigger, we started the breath. The limit variable is going to kind of put a cap on it. I don't like to use the same word in the definition, but it's going to put a cap, like a max on the breath. So you're saying don't go above a certain volume or don't go above a certain pressure. Because if you didn't, it could go as high as it wanted. So we have to say, we need the parameters on it. Does that make sense? So let's just say that is the max or the cap on the breath. And this is easy. Volume or pressure. The end. What we use for limit is volume and pressure. It's one or the other normally. So we're either saying don't go above a certain volume or don't go above a certain pressure. So we would say it's volume limited or pressure limited. Another word you're going to hear is volume control and pressure control. Same thing. Volume control. Pressure control. So these are interchangeable. So you might see a question or something that says your ventilator is in a volume limited mode. It's just saying volume control, you guys. It's no different. So volume, we're saying don't go above a certain volume during the breath. So pressure, we're saying don't go above a certain pressure. So when you get to 500, don't go above 500, or whatever your tidal volume is set at. So this is gonna be my tidal volume. And this is gonna be my inspiratory pressure if I'm in pressure control. So in pressure control, we're gonna say don't go above 20, or whatever we decide to set it at. Make sense?
Is that a I? On
Where?
After max?
No, slash.
Oh, slash.
Max slash cap. It's like the top. Haley?
So these are like your alarms that you're setting.
No, alarms are different, because this is an actual setting as part of the breath. So I'm gonna say, I'm gonna set my tidal volume at 400, which means it's not gonna go above 400. My alarms are gonna be above and below that setting. So say, if you go this high or this low, then you need to alarm. So this is actual settings that we set. Okay? Easy peasy? I told you the last two were easier. Then number 3 is the cycle. And what does the cycle do?
Terminates the breath.
Yes, it ends the breath. Allows expiration to happen. So it ends inspiration, allows exhalation to happen. So the most common one here is time cycled. There's also flow cycled, but we're gonna not talk about that one today. You won't see volume cycled or any other crazy one it mentioned in the book if there was one. Time cycled means what? When the inspiratory time is up, the breath ends. This does not end the breath. Just because you reach your tidal volume doesn't mean the breath is over. The breath will not end until your inspiratory time is over. Does that make sense? So volume limited, time cycle, volume control. It's just saying that when inspiratory time is over, the breath ends. Just fancy words for what's happening. But that's how we tell the ventilator what to do. One other thing is called pressure cycling. This is the high pressure alarm. Remember that cycle means ends the breath. So if I'm pressure cycling, that means as soon as I hit the pressure, the breath ends. So that's why I said it's the high pressure alarm. Because no matter what we do, we always have to have a cap on the pressure so we don't hurt our patient. Because what happens if the pressure's too high? What are we going to do? Cause a pneumo. And we don't want to do that. So let's say that the patient hits the max pressure, they cough, or a mucus plug. Patient has a mucus plug. So if you hit that high pressure, the breath is going to stop, literally. It hits the pressure and it stops because we told it that if you hit a pressure of 35, which is what we normally set it at, then you need to stop the breath immediately. Because if you don't put a pressure limit on there, it's just a machine. It's going to keep trying to build pressure to get through whatever that obstruction is. So pressure cycling looks like this. Up, down, up, down, up, down. Is your patient ventilating if this is happening? No. The breath is going up, stop, up, stop, up, stop, up, stop. That's what you would see if you had like a mucus plug. Yes.
So if they're pressure cycling, they're not gonna have any E time.
They're not gonna have anything, yeah.
It's just gonna.
It's just gonna continue to do this. So if you see something like this, if your ventilator is doing nonstop pressure cycling, it is an emergency. Gotta figure out what's wrong. Is there a kink? Is it cut off somewhere? Does the patient have a mucus plug? Gotta figure it out real quick or the patient's gonna code. So when we say pressure cycling, then we mean the high pressure alarm. So another way you'll sometimes see this is your ventilator is alarming and the high pressure alarm is being hit. What happens during that? Inspiration ends prematurely. It's a fancy way to say the breath stops. Up, stop, up, stop. Emergency, figure it out. Get them off the vent, try to bag them, see if they got a plug. If you bag them and you're not having any issues, you've got a blockage in the vent somewhere. If you bag them and you can't, you're bagging your patient and you can't do anything, what do you do? Okay, you're on, what do you do first? Try to pass a suction catheter. Can't pass a suction catheter, what do? You're taking your boards, what do?
You're extubating.
Extubating, we never put saline down the tube if you're taking the test. Remember. So, pressure alarm's going off like crazy. Take your patient off and bag them. You can't bag them. What do? Okay, that's if you're taking, that's not next. You can't bag them. What do you do next? Pass a suction catheter. Okay, let's try it again. Your patient, the alarm's going off like this, nonstop. When your patient's in distress and they're not ventilating, what do you do first? Take them off and bag them. Then what do you do?
Suction.
Suction. Do we need to do this again?
Yes.
Patient is on the vent in distress. Your pressure alarm's going off nonstop. What do you do first?
Bag.
Take them off and bag them. Then what do you do next?
Suction.
Try to pass a suction catheter. You're taking your boards. What do you do next? You can't pass a suction catheter. Extubate. You're in clinic. You can't pass a suction catheter. What do you do? Saline and bag. Okay. We'll do that a few more times later. Then you extubate. Okay. So let's go work on your ventilators until 10:45 and then we'll take a break, okay? All right. Top to it. You guys bring 2 minutes.